Well, thank you very much, Jim. I'm not entirely sure that's what I'm going to talk about, but nonetheless, let me just start by saying that what I would like to do today are two things. One is I would like to use the 5-year plan that is being announced right now to set the context, and secondly, to think through whether or not China will indeed win the clean tech race when it comes down to it. It doesn't take a great genius to figure out that China is currently at a crossroad if you look at the 5-year plan, not least because the 30-year model that has given it enormous and unprecedented growth has to change. The question I often get asked is how much of it has got to do with climate change and how much has it got to do with other factors. I would suggest that, like most governments, evidently there are many factors, but perhaps on top of which is resource security and energy security, which are closely linked to climate-related objectives. If you look at the 5-year plan in such light, then all the announcements that are being made right now in terms of reduction in energy intensity, carbon intensity, increasing renewable energy makes perfect sense. But perhaps most important for the context of this discussion today, I think I would like to point you to two things that are being announced. The first one, which was not expected, I must add, and we had many discussions with various policymakers and decision makers all over the world about whether China will indeed have a cap on its energy consumption. The rumor is that there will be one, and it will fix the amount of absolute energy that it would use in the next 5 years to something like 4 billion co-equivalent, I think. And the significance are many, one of which is that we often have this received wisdom that China is not willing to commit to absolute targets, that it would only do so in an incremental fashion. And I wonder whether or not this is indeed a slight change in policy, partly driven by what we're seeing in recent weeks and the oil-related implications that comes with it. But the second one that I want to point to are the investment in what they call the 7 pillar industries, of which renewable energy, ICT, but also lots of related sectors are part of, including environmental conservation energies. So if you put all these together, it does strike me that the policy context in China today is indeed that there is movement towards a greener and a lower carbon economy. It's not clear to me it is a low carbon one and not when it will achieve a low carbon one, but it's certainly the direction of travel is clear. But the central challenge, of course, is that, I just want to throw in that one of the other policy announcements that I think are important are piloting of low-carbon development in specific geographic areas. We all know that Chinese growth began 30 years ago by special economic zones, and there are indeed now 5 provinces and 8 cities that will be designated as low-carbon piloting areas. And there is great hope that a country run by engineers so far would indeed use these as laboratories and have more favorable investment, for example, opportunities for those who are interested in cleaner energy, lower carbon, and more environmentally sustainable pursuits. But of course, the central challenge is that this particular pathway, while the direction is clear, has many challenges. And the central one is indeed that the coal-based economy in China is still going to be what is driving a lot of growth in the coming decade. And China would have to manage this transition, not only in terms of what it promised to deliver, but also delivering a lot of the other goals that it needs to do. And they would include, as we see with the announcements on income tax, etc., socially inclusive growth, a much higher value addition to its exports. While everyone else in the world gets scared by China's export numbers, the Chinese are more than aware that its value addition is very low. I've seen different studies estimating something like $3 and $10 are actually captured in China, and in most of the sectors that we get to know Chinese industries best, the numbers are even lower. I think the famous one is Barbie doll, where a $20 Barbie doll, only 5 cents is accrued in China, but who knows whether this is true. Also, it has to deliver a more viable services sector, much more domestic consumption to rebalance the economy, reform the SOEs, which it knows is now stopping it from taking it to the next stage, but also, perhaps very important for this conversation again, a transition to a genuinely more knowledge-based economy. So then to answer the question that Jim said me, which is will China win the technology race when it comes to the lower carbon and low carbon economy? My quick answer is I don't know. I think that we cannot assume it today. Why? We've studied a lot of patents a year and a half ago, 60,000 of them, in the report that Chatham House published called Who Owns Our Low Carbon Future? We looked at 6 clean energy sectors, we looked at all the subsectors as well, and found a number of things. First of all, even though there are now far more patents being filed in China with geographical assignees from China, when you really look at the numbers, most of them are still members of multinational companies. So what is still driving a lot of at least the innovation-related activities, I don't know whether patents necessarily turn into innovations for us. Most of them are still driven by international investments and multinationals, and fewer of them are driven domestically in China. Secondly, we also found out that if you look at the top 20 companies in each of the sectors in terms of patent filing, whether in the subsectors or the sectors, it's very detailed work. Most of the top 20 companies are nowhere near, or most of the Chinese and other BRIC companies are nowhere near the top 20. And perhaps more important than that right now is the recognition that innovation, in some ways, are not based on investment in one sector because they don't necessarily follow the logic of the economic sector. With digitized information, we can now quite easily find out that, for example, a lot of innovation in solar came from satellite technologies, a lot of wind technologies came from automobile, etc. What this means is that one of the main issues is whether China will have the system that is open enough that will be indeed conducive to genuine innovation. So even though China is indeed producing an enormous amount of wind turbines, an enormous amount of solar PV, the question of whether or not they can move away from or just being able to answer consumer question for the next stage of adaptation of the new technology, or whether they can come up with genuine innovation, I think is still an open question. Thank you. Sorry.